Hello, students, and welcome to part 2 of our lecture on World War I, which in your textbook is chapter 10. So on April 2nd, 1917, after all these events, Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war, and they grant that. Now, what happened during the war on the home front? There's a few things to discuss. One is the Selective Service Act, which created the draft. This is not the first time the draft had been instituted. It had been instituted, for example, in the Civil War. But the Selective Service Act created the draft again. Very controversial. The Committee on Public Information was basically the propaganda wing of our war effort. It, quote unquote, educated the public about the war. Basically, it persuaded the people that we needed to fight and that the Central Powers were bad people. Some people were conscientious objectors, which this Sergeant Alvin York, which we'll discuss later, was initially a conscientious objector, someone who refuses to fight because of their religious beliefs. Now, this is still around today. If someone wants to claim this, they have to prove, though, that they are a member of an established religion that is vowed against fighting or violence in any form. We also passed the Espionage Act, which allowed the post office to screen mail for anti-war propaganda. This was seen to some people as an invasion of privacy. Again, very controversial, as a lot of these acts that are passed during wartime. We find out many of them are controversial because they take away our personal freedoms or infringe upon our personal freedoms for a brief period of time while we're fighting the war. There's also a lot of anti-German sentiment, in other words, feeling of German hatred or German dislike. For example, we renamed anything with a German-sounding name. Hamburgers became Liberty Steaks. Dachshunds became Liberty Pups. They stopped listening to Beethoven and other German music. People stopped speaking the German language, and there was even many cases of violence against Germans within this country. Again, part of this anti-German sentiment created in part by the Committee on Public Information we discussed earlier, and then fueled by things like Yellow Press, which we discussed in Chapter 9, exaggerating real events. Women filled jobs left behind by soldiers. We see this phenomenon in World War I and World War II and other wars we'll discuss later in the year. The men leave the factories to go fight the war. The women fill those jobs. And not only women, but large numbers of African Americans moved north to the factories, to the towns with factories to work and fill those jobs left behind by the soldiers. In fact, so many of them moved, this became known as the Great Migration. Large numbers of blacks moved north to fill factory jobs. John J. Pershing was the commander of U.S. forces in World War I. By the time we entered combat, it was June 1917, and John J. Pershing is quoted as saying, when he landed in Europe, in France, he stepped onto French soil and said, "Lafayette, we are here." This, of course, referring to the Marquis de Lafayette, which came to he came to the aid of Americans during the Revolutionary War. He came here and sacrificed much of his fortunes, risked his life to help fight for American independence. So Pershing was basically saying, we are returning the favor when he said, "Lafayette, we are here." Here's a picture of John J. Pershing. So what was U.S. impact in the war? Essentially, we secured victory for the Allies. The European nations had been fighting for several years at this point, and they were tired, they were worn out, they were malnourished, they were fatigued. When we came, we brought energy, life, vitality, health, and in fact, we're nicknamed Doughboys in part because of how plump and how well-fed and healthy we were compared to the European soldiers. So a quick rundown of some important U.S. battles are here. We won't discuss those really. They're basically explained on the slide. But here are a few select battles in which Americans played a prominent role. We mentioned Alvin York earlier. He was the greatest World War I hero. He was a mountain man from Tennessee who grew up hunting for his food and living off the land. He was recruited by a local recruiting officer who had heard about him through through word of mouth and him winning different shooting contests, that he was pretty much a professional expert marksman, and that he was. So he was drafted. He initially claimed to be a conscientious objector. However, the preacher of his church talked him into fighting, impressing upon him the need to defend our country and maintain our freedom of religion. With 16 others, he took out an entire German position and for this won the Congressional Medal of Honor, since he did it only with a machine gun and a pistol. He showed extreme bravery on the battlefield. And here is a picture of Sergeant Alvin York. So on November 11th, 1918, with Americans joining the fight and finishing off the Central Powers, Germany surrendered, the aftermath being 5 million Allies and 8 million Central Power troops dead, and 6.5 million civilians dead. Huge, astounding numbers. Never before in the history of the world had these types of casualties been seen in warfare. Wilson had a plan for peace after World War I, and he called it the 14 Points. A major component of this was a creation of what he called a League of Nations, where all the nations of the world would come together and work out their problems peacefully. This was part of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. It was very, very harsh on Germany. It included things like a war guilt clause in which Germany had to claim responsibility for starting the whole thing. And it made Germany pay what were known as reparations, which are payments for war damages. These reparations were so intense and so severe that it destroyed the German economy. It led to an economic depression in Germany, which will eventually lead to the rise of the National Socialist Party or Nazi Party led by Adolf Hitler. So there's a huge, huge connection between the Treaty of Versailles and World War II, in that the Treaty of Versailles was so hard on Germany, it bred the conditions in which World War II would spring. And again, it was humiliating to Germany because they had to accept guilt for the whole thing. And it included the League of Nations that Wilson had created as part of his 14 points. However, it was rejected by the U.S. Senate in large part because the Republicans, which controlled the Senate, the Republican leadership was not invited to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. Woodrow Wilson did it unilaterally. This angered Henry Cabot Lodge, and he refused to allow the Senate to ratify this treaty. Again, under the Constitution, the president can enter a treaty, but the Senate must ratify it. The Senate did not, and Wilson would not compromise on the principles that he had laid forth with the Republicans. And without U.S. participation, the League of Nations failed, even though our president created it. But without our power, without our influence, without our money, it was doomed to fail, and it did. So what are the long-term effects? Some of the economic effects that led to inflation across the world, especially in Germany, because of rising prices. We became the world's largest and best economy because we were unscathed, pretty much, from the fighting. We had labor strikes in the U.S. due to some negative economic conditions resulting from the war, such as inflation, as already mentioned. And women and African Americans were replaced by the returning soldiers. They left the factories and returned to their more traditional roles they'd had before the war. We also had the Red Scare within the United States, which was a widespread fear of communism. As a part of this Red Scare, we had the Sacco and Vetti incident, where Italian immigrants were executed for a crime that, in reality, they probably didn't commit, but probably because they're anarchists. And America had turned into a conservative mood and elected Warren G. Harding, a Republican president, in 1920, which was a rejection of Wilson and the Democrats, which they viewed as getting us into the war, and they weren't pleased with the way things went. Socially, Americans desired a return to normalcy, which is the ideal version of American life before World War I. This, in fact, was created by Warren G. Harding on the campaign trail, and this was affirmed by the American voters, and they elected him as president. And this concludes our lecture on World War I. Thank you for watching.